Moscow is under massive attack from Ukrainian drones. But is the real damage not buildings hit, but in the minds of the Russian people? Plus, is the Russian economy on the brink? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about whether or not Ukraine's strategy of hitting Russia where it hurts is starting to pay off. Now, before we get started, of course, guys, please try to become a member over on combatvetnews.com. That's my version of Patreon. It's where you guys can support me. You know, I cover a lot of controversial issues here, and I'm not afraid to speak the truth to power, but I can only do that because you guys have my back. So check the link in the description, become a member, get the uncensored combat videos, and twice weekly updates, and, of course, support your boy. Okay, so reportedly, Ukraine has launched dozens, reportedly over 160 drones into all various regions around Russia. And Russian air defenses claim to have shot down nearly 24 of them heading towards Moscow. Now, you might recall that every time this happens, the Russians will accurately report all of the drones that were downed, and then they will claim that the successful drone strikes are simply debris falling on Russian infrastructure, even if literal videos are posted on Russian social media showing otherwise. So the fact that there are strike packages from Ukraine now numbering into the hundreds is a sign that they are at least starting to ramp up their own long-range drone production comparable to Moscow's. But the fact is that the targets up until this point have been heavily focused on Russian refineries, Russian oil and gas industry, the economic heart of Putin's regime. But the reality is that we have seen that these achieve really significant effects, right? There was a massive Russian gas crisis over the course of the summer, and Russian gas prices remain unbelievably high as Ukraine hits these refineries and then continues to pound on them. But what's even more interesting is that there's been a picture going viral on Russian and even US social media of this. This is literally a Russian air defense pickup truck outside of the Kremlin. And what is troubling about this to the Russian regime is that protecting the regime is the only thing that Putin is mandated by the Russian public to do, right? This is the strong man's bargain. In countries that experience tremendous instability, the prospect of a strong dictator is accepted by the public and by the oligarchs of these countries because they believe he will keep them safe from external threats. And so for Putin, that means, of course, manufacturing threats that don't really exist. For example, his claims that NATO is totally about to invade Russia and has been totally about to invade Russia for years. But the fact is that the people tolerate the loss of their freedoms, the loss of their rights, the fact that they have no say in who governs their country, the looting of public coffers and handouts to insider oligarchs. They tolerate that because they get in exchange safety and stability. And again, the Russian public that remembers Moscow of the 90s understands that that was a frighteningly dangerous place to be, and they lovingly tolerate Putin as long as he can provide that stability. So the fact that Moscow is now resorting to protecting the heart and soul of the regime with pickup trucks and machine guns is kind of insane. Because Russia has a lot of advanced anti-aircraft systems, and they have deployed a ton of them. Here is a partial mark of the different air defense sites confirmed by social media and dash cams or suspected in the little question marks. You can see that literally Moscow is now ringed with Pantsir and other air defense systems. And the fact that this is seen as insufficient and that Russia has to deploy dudes with machine guns on a truck to defend the Kremlin itself from attack is a sign that Russia knows that it can't even protect its capital city, the heart of Russia, the source of some of its most, where every oligarch lives, where every major government official lives, right? Where all of the metropolitan Russians that are highly educated, highly involved, and have the actual leverage to oppose the state, right? Because up until this point, the primary victims of Putin's war have been the impoverished Russians, the rural Russians, the ethnic and linguistic minorities in Russia that get recruited to fight Putin's war and killed in Ukraine. Everyone else has somewhat benefited from this war in the form of higher wages, in the form of less competition, in the form of huge state contracts being given out to companies. But the fact is that this core, think about this as the defense of, again, the core Russian oligarchs, the core Russian political appointees. They cannot be protected by Russia now. And not only is the damage spiritual, right? Because I think that's really what this is. The residents of Moscow, from low-level bureaucrats to vice presidents at Russian companies, they now have to look up to the sky and wonder if they are going to be next. And to say, damn, I've suffered so much under this Putinist regime. Massive inflation, economic downturn, over 1 million Russians killed. And for what? For a state that can't even protect our capital city from Ukrainian drones. But that's not the only problem here, because the oligarchs, and remember, in Russia, if you can turn the oligarchs, you can turn the regime, because power in these kind of polities, authoritarians like this, rests in really the oligarchs who provide the money and in the political appointees who control the security forces. And those individuals are increasingly under strain, not just from a physical safety perspective, but also economically. See, the Russian energy minister is rolling out blatant lies, claiming there was panic buying during that initial wave of Ukrainian strikes on refineries that caused a huge shortage of gasoline. Now, gasoline prices remain up by nearly 12% since the start of the year, but there were, in a tacit interview, the energy minister claims that it was just messages about temporary shutdowns at some facilities, code for Ukrainian drone strikes, right? Also fueled panic buying and a jump in exchange prices. Independent media, of course, shows that Ukrainian drone strikes, the actual taking of those facilities offline, were the main factor behind the fuel crunch, disrupting operations in 22 plants since August, leading to shortages at filling stations in 52 different Russian regions, right? The minister said that the government helped stabilize domestic wholesale gasoline prices, which hit record highs in August and September, right? He said that, don't worry, demand is going to fall as the refinery wraps up repairs, and that should restore some balance in the gasoline market. But of course, once the refineries are back online, chances are the Ukrainians are just going to hit them, right? Or the Ukrainians, more likely, their strategy in this is forcing Russia to make only terrible choices, because they have a very limited number of Pantsir systems, and Russia is huge, right? One Pantsir can't defend both a refinery and the capital city. And so by saying, listen, yeah, you've deployed your air defenses to protect all your refineries while they are under repair, well and good. But now we're going to target your government facilities in Moscow. And this, including some of your symbolic representations of the state itself, right? Look, it's like the United States. After 9/11, the U.S. felt vulnerable because the Pentagon had been destroyed. That itself, the Pentagon, right, the Department of Defense continued to function fine. It has backups on backups on backups. But the fact that in the heart of the United States, in the heart of the Department of Defense, there was the ability to launch a massive annihilating strike was itself disturbing and projected massive fear into the hearts of American people. And so the Ukrainians are saying, fine, if you want to protect your oil refineries, great. But now we're going to target your central military facilities, your government facilities, right? Legitimate targets, but targets way unthinkably deep into Russian territory. And so now the Russians have to go, okay, well, now we're going to deploy our Pantsir systems to Moscow. Well, but something else has just been made vulnerable. Perhaps naval bases in Crimea, perhaps air bases in occupied Ukraine, perhaps refineries again. So this sort of inability to actually control the situation is a testament to the Ukrainian strategy. But remember, this is not a military strategy. It is a political strategy, as every military strategy is. But that is the core thing, is to say, listen, this isn't, the difference is that 9/11 happened and then the U.S. embarked on a 20-plus year war that, to be honest, as someone who served in it, the average American stopped giving a shit about after 3 years. But the difference is that the Russian people have been under sanction, experiencing massive price increases, experiencing massive, significant hardship, significant economic hardship now. And now, after 4 years of victories, now the Ukrainians are striking at the heart of Moscow. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like losing, right? Imagine if the terrorists had just launched increasing attacks on the United States. Imagine if there was, after 4 years of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, Islamic terrorists did a 9/11 every single week. The U.S. public would go, guys, the U.S. government says we're winning, but we're clearly not. That's the message the Russian public, and again, particularly the Russian oligarchy, is going to be taking from this. And again, in the United States, if things are going in a bad direction, we can vote in new leaders, new elected officials, right? We have the right to even advocate. We can go out in the streets, as many Americans did. The largest anti-war protest in U.S. history was in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. That's rights we all have. Those are rights Russians don't have. They gave up all of those for security, something that Vladimir Putin is failing to provide. But I want to point out another thing. We talked about the fact that inflation, a punishment that hits every single Russian, has been running rampant, right? You can see this is obviously the official Russian inflation data. And we've talked on this channel that the official Russian inflation data is probably being underreported, because when we look at, we looked at food vlogs in Moscow and found that over the last 2 or 3 years, food prices have increased more like 25% a year instead of the reported 8%. Now, you can see that at the initial invasion, there was a big spike in prices as sanctions started to bite, 13%. Then inflation steadily came under control in 2023 as Russian sanctions evasion got better and countries like China and Iran became willing to supply Russia. Then in 2024, you can see that the massive militarization of the Russian economy is starting to have really negative effects. You can see by July, inflation cracking a 9%, 8.6, 8.5, 8.5, 9.5. So you can see that Russian inflation is going in the wrong direction. And then finally this year, Russia is on pace for a 10% or a 9.5% inflation rate, a huge out of control inflation problem for the Russian Federation. And despite this massive amount of inflation, the Russian stock market denominated in rubles is actually hitting a low, right? It is on par with the December 2024 low and has not been significantly below that number since April of 23. And the thing to take away, right, the bottom of the sanctions for the Russian state. But remember, 2,400 rubles in April of 23, that was nearly like, 25% inflation ago. So really this number should be 25% below that, several hundred rubles down. Really, so in terms of actual purchasing power of the ruble, I would suspect that what we're really looking at is an all-time low in real terms for the Russian stock market. And again, if you want to know where oligarchs hurt, this chart is worth 1,000 rural Russians killed by a Ukrainian drone. This is worth 100 Pantsir systems failing to stop a Ukrainian drone, because oligarchs are motivated by one thing: money, right? You don't become a billionaire Russian oligarch unless you love money. Because remember, billionaires they have big money and they're big targets for people like Vladimir Putin. These guys could have just taken 500 million and fucked off somewhere, and lived a life of absolute luxury, but they love money so much that they said, no, 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 it's not enough to have 500 million. It's not enough to have a billion. I want multiple billions of dollars, even if it means that I have to stay on Vladimir Putin's good side. And if I don't, I'm going to get pushed out a window. So the fact that these guys are losing, again, hundreds of millions of dollars in this collapse, in addition to being personally sanctioned, they're going to get tired of it. And we've seen it. We've seen more and more Russian oligarchs getting targeted with sanctions, having their assets seized, being arrested on trumped up charges. It's increasingly, Putin looks increasingly desperate, even though, again, he calls President Trump and says things like, oh, my economy is doing great. Guys, even President Trump can see this and be like, dog, your economy is not doing great. So we are going to see if this actually returns anything. Vladimir Putin is a survivor. He's like a cockroach, right? You can nuke him and he'll still find a way to keep his regime intact. But this is quite possibly the biggest crisis now that Putin has ever faced. An economic crisis, a diplomatic crisis, a military crisis, and a political crisis. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Thanks to guys like Sergei Zinchenko, Thomas Anderson, William Alex, Anka Georgiev, L90, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.